Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there in Helsinki with you, but good morning from New York City. I'm hearing a bit of an echo, so I'm going to turn myself off. Okay, today I'm going to speak with you about misinformation and a technique that we're finding quite optimistic called prebunking. This is going to complement everything you were just hearing on the panel before me about education and media literacy. And it's something that we can think about as practitioners, as governments, as platforms. This is an approach that we are optimistic is quite scalable. So if you go to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit more about who Jigsaw is and why we're working on this. Great. So Jigsaw is a unit within Google that has been exploring threats to open societies, threats like misinformation and disinformation, for over 10 years. And we work very collaboratively. We work across with academics, with civil society, with technologists, to explore different novel ways to proactively address threats online. So we have the research arm, which I lead, and we also have technologists who build products that are all free and open source. Move to the next slide. Today, I'll be talking about why I think it's so critical for us to get ahead of misinformation. This is not going to be news to folks in Finland who have been doing this so well with media literacy for years, but I'll talk about prebunking as a complement to what you're already doing, offer some historical context on what it is and how it's been applied to misinformation. And then I'll talk about how prebunking fits alongside other interventions and show a case study. These are findings that are hot off the press from work that my team and I and our colleagues in Central Europe have been doing in Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. I think they're really promising findings that are replicable and scalable for others watching right now. Okay, without further ado, let's dive in. They talk about getting ahead of misinformation, especially in the context of the EU. Next slide. So this is not news to anyone in this audience that misinformation is frequently taken out of context, and it frequently goes viral in minutes. The example I have here from last year is a video that went viral in Germany. And this video at the bottom blames Ukrainian refugees, ukrainische Flüchtlinge, for setting homes on fire in southern Germany. And now what actually happened was they took a video from 2013 and they spliced it with this logo of a German news organization and this headline at the bottom to completely fabricate the video. But of course, by the time this has been discovered by fact checkers, the video has already gone viral and it's been shared by thousands of people on social media. Next slide. So debunking, or fact-checking after the misinformation has gone viral, is very important. And it's wonderful that we now have confirmation that that video is actually from 2013 and not 2022. But that fact check was insufficient given the speed and the scale that that misinformation traveled. We have some statistics here that show, for example, a false story reaches people 6 times faster on average than a true story does. And even well-resourced fact checkers like those at Facebook typically take at least 72 hours before they can correct misinformation. Next slide. So I'll posit the question, can we preempt misinformation to prevent its viral spread? Can we help people spot it and be better equipped to not believe it before they see it? Next slide. So we can preempt these narratives. Surprise, surprise. This is something called prebunking. And it works because of one little weakness in misinformation. So this is my seed of optimism for you all, is that misinformation reuses the same tactics and narratives. It's repetitive. And so we can spot the patterns and anticipate future misinformation when we look historically. So let's do that really quickly. Next slide. In the example that I just opened with about the Ukrainian refugees being blamed for burning down houses in 2022, we can anticipate something like that by looking just a few years before at the prior EU migrant crisis in 2015 and 2016. And next slide. In 2015 and 2016, we saw all of these terrible depictions of migrants coming to Europe being shown as criminals, as rapists, as an economic threat to Europe. I think this is a particularly graphic example of that from Poland that really dehumanizes these refugees. But the narratives here are the same. These are dangerous people. They're going to harm people. They're going to burn our houses down, right? And so we can really anticipate that narrative if we look historically. Next slide. So one thing that I keep getting asked is this all Russian? Do we know that this is Russian disinformation? And I actually think that for prebunking, unlike debunking, where the origin matters, for us, the creator and the origin point is not actually that important. So the source, of the misinformation from 2015 here about refugees, maybe it was the Polish magazine. The source of this video, maybe it was pro-Kremlin groups. We're actually not sure who originally made it. But in both cases, it's actually not the most important thing for prebunking. Next slide. The most important thing is to focus on the underlying technique. We have to teach people how to spot these techniques that are being used to manipulate them. In the case of the Polish magazine cover, it's evoking fear. It's doing something called fear-mongering, or manipulating your emotions by evoking fear. In the example from Germany, it's doing something called scapegoating. This is a technique where you're blaming one group of people for a problem. That house happened to be burning down because of an electrical issue, but the refugees were being scapegoated. So if you learn to spot these techniques, you can then identify them with any piece of misinformation, whether it's about refugees or something else. So this approach is much more scalable. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Next slide. So what is prebunking? I've talked a lot about why I think it's important in the context of the European Union, but let's go back in time and understand where it comes from and how to do it. Next slide. Prebunking is simply a communication technique, and it uses this metaphor from medicine of creating mental antibodies or mental defenses against a future encounter with propaganda. So just in the same way that you might get vaccinated against a future encounter with a disease, this is like a mental vaccine against a future encounter with some form of misinformation. And the goal of prebunking is to help people gain resilience to being misled in the future, just like media literacy. Next slide. Prebunking is one of many approaches to address misinformation, and it complements media literacy. It comes far before someone's actual encounter with misinformation. Now, I like using this timeline of different intervention approaches here because you can see that there is a lot of emphasis in our current discourse on the right side of the timeline. We have a lot of discussion about warnings and labels, about debunking, and increasingly the research that my team and other experts are doing shows that actually we should be putting a lot more emphasis on the left side of this timeline, on reaching people before the misinformation goes viral. Next slide. Prebunking has actually been well tested across different topics. It was created in the 1960s by a social psychologist and has been applied in many fields as public health and the environment. And only in the last 5 years or so has it really been applied to misinformation and things like hate. So I think it's really important to note that this is something that's robust, but it's also something that hasn't been devised for the internet age. Next slide. That's something that my team at Jigsaw is working on doing. We're testing and refining this approach for the internet age, and we're working very closely to do that with academic institutions. So these are 3 examples of prebunking videos that we've made. And we decided that the best way to scale these prebunking messages was in short 30 to 90-second videos that convey to people either what a common misinformation technique is, like scapegoating. So in the videos of the cartoons on the left, those were our first major test that we did with some universities in the UK. We test first on a lab setting where we have a controlled environment, we're paying people to participate in our study. And then when we're confident that it works, that it doesn't have a backfire effect, we go to social media. And so what I'll show you in just a second in the case study is how we've taken these videos to scale on social media. But I'll note that we've also used this approach for more specific types of misinformation, like anti-vaccine misinformation and white and male supremacist narratives. So it's a very adaptable approach. Prebunking can really address either general topics, like a general vaccine, or be very specific to very targeted types of misinformation. Okay, next slide. I want to call out 3 advantages that we've found with prebunking. And this is sort of the rationale for why is Google investing in this? Why are we doing this now in many countries around the world? The first is we have evidence that this really builds resilience for people. It allows them to boost their abilities to detect and then reject misleading information. Second is it can be very apolitical in its approach. It focuses on the underlying techniques of the misinformation rather than specific claims. So it's not about this particular politician cheated in the election. It will help prebunk the claim that the election system is rigged, right? And so it's anticipating the higher level narratives or the higher level techniques rather than the really granular claims. It also is framed as self-defense. So we found that this approach actually works quite well across the political spectrum. And lastly, it's very accessible and non-judgmental. We found that prebunking is a boost. It's educational. It works for people with low education levels, and it doesn't presume that the audience has done anything wrong. The viewer of the prebunking message is actually the one being taken advantage of and misled, and so it's not judgmental towards them at all. Okay, next slide. Let's get to the findings, and then I'll show you an example of what a prebunking message actually looks like. Next slide. So I gave you the example at the top about anti-Ukrainian migrant misinformation. So we anticipated early last year that when the war started and Ukrainians began to leave, that there would be very serious flows of Ukrainian migrants and that there would also be misinformation about these migrants. So we went and talked to local experts. We went to Poland and to Czech Republic and to Slovakia, and we met with experts there from academia, fact checkers who are in the media, who are in government and think tanks, and we wanted them to help us anticipate what were going to be the emerging misinformation narratives about refugees. And just like we did at the start of this talk, these looked historically with us, and they looked back to the last couple migrant crises, or back toward relationships between their population and Ukraine, and said, what are going to be the likely narratives about Ukrainian migrants coming to our country? And we identified 2. In all 3 countries, these were the 2 dominant narratives, which I think is very interesting. The first was an economic narrative that blamed Ukrainian refugees for the shortage of basic necessities like housing. This is, again, the idea of scapegoating. So we were able to focus one of our sets of videos on scapegoating refugees for taking these basic necessities. The second narrative was a security narrative that was blaming refugees for rising crime. And so this was, again, that idea of fear-mongering, of evoking fear that the refugees are going to be dangerous. To produce these videos, which you'll see in a minute, there's little screenshots of them here, we worked with a number of collaborators. We worked with local creative agencies. We worked with civil groups like MASK in Poland, as well as with fact checkers and civil society groups. This is just a set of them. All right, if we go to the next slide, let's watch one of these 60-second prebunking videos from the Czech.
Válka neprobíhá pouze na Ukrajině. Ovlivňuje nás všechny i skrze naše mobilní telefony. Pro výhru jsou totiž někteří ochotní udělat cokoliv. Například v nás vyvolávat strach tím, že všechny ukrajinské uprchlíky označí za nebezpečné.
Ahoj, jsi tady?
Jsem, ale asi půjdu. Už bude tma a já si teď večer sama venku nepřipadám úplně bezpečně, co jsou tu ty uprchlíci.
Počkej, to myslíš vážně?
Teď čtu na internetu, že připadávají lidi přímo na ulici. Teď jsou nebezpeční.
Většina uprchlíků jsou jenom ženy a malí děti. Jde jenom o snahu vyvolat v nás strach.
Proč by lhali?
Některý lidi nás chtějí proti Ukrajincům poštvat. Je jednodušší ovlivnit lidi, kteří se něčeho bojí a odvést pozornost od skutečného důvodu, proč tady uprchlíci jsou. A to je válka.
Pokud v nás někdo vyvolává strach, může se pokoušet ovlivnit naše emoce a zmanipulovat nás. Metoda vyvolávání strachu je jednou z nejběžnějších taktik pro šíření dezinformací. Nenechte se sebou manipulovat.
Okay, I hope you all enjoyed that example of prebunking. I think that really encapsulates what we are trying to do. Let me tell you a little bit more about how we measured success and then how well it performed. And then I'll encourage all of you to replicate that in Finland and beyond. So with the video that you just saw and 5 others, we reached a very wide audience using ads. So that video was shown to people right in their player on either Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or TikTok as an ad. And we showed these as an ad campaign, just like any other third-party advertiser. We bought ads. And so this is fully replicable by other people. The videos, as you saw, were customized to local context and language. And audiences saw one of 2 videos, either one about fear-mongering or scapegoating. Now, to measure success, we did something called a custom brand lift survey. This is what's here on the right side of the screen. We were really quizzing people to see if they had learned what that technique was. Did they learn what fear-mongering was or what scapegoating was? We also looked at reach. How many people did we actually get to show this video to? Next slide. So the good news is with this approach, in 3 months, from September to December, we reached over 38 million Europeans in these 3 countries. We reached almost a third of the Polish, Czech, and Slovak population. And so here are just the view numbers from September. I don't even have all the numbers, but just incredibly large numbers because we were able to reach huge saturation levels of the people who were online in these populations on those 4 different platforms I mentioned: YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Next slide. The good news is people who watch the videos actually learn something from them, which I think, it's not intuitive that people learn something from advertisements. So this was really wonderful news for us. More people could identify these misinformation tactics after watching the video. So in our first round of videos in September and October, the percentage of people who got that question right relative to a control group was quite low. It was 0 to 2%. And so we iterated and we learned on what we did. And then we started to more focus the videos on reaching people who actually watched ads. And when we did that, we saw numbers go up. So in Poland, we saw an average of 3 to 3.6% of more people getting those answers correct than a control group. We even got up to 8% of viewers in some videos in the Czech Republic. And so what this says to us is it's really important to figure out how to reach people who are going to watch these videos. So we have a lot more to learn here. But even 0 to 8% is a success because that means that hundreds of thousands of people in these 3 countries gained resilience to misinformation. Next slide. So looking ahead, I think we can empower others to use this technique. What we've done was really just a demonstration, a pilot, and everything that we've done here is replicable. Next slide. So one of the things that we're doing is open sourcing this approach. Now, obviously, prebunking predated Jigsaw and Google, so that was already open sourced. But we've been publishing how to do the video creation and the ad campaigns that we've done so that others can follow the same approach. We've been partnering so that we can localize these campaigns. So in 2023, we'll be working with various countries around the world, including India and elsewhere, to scale prebunking locally in a way that makes sense for each region. And finally, we're refining those measures of success. We want to know, can people trust the messenger of the misinformation? Are they willing to share the misinformation? So there are a number of other things that we would like to measure for success here beyond just if they can correctly identify scapegoating or fear-mongering or whatever the technique is. So to help us do this, next slide. Next slide, please. We recently launched a website. which has all of our research to date on prebunking on the right side here, alongside other interventions that we encourage folks to use as well for different contexts, noting that prebunking is not a silver bullet. It can be used alongside lots of other approaches, including media literacy, to really boost people's resilience to misinformation online. The website here is interventionswithgoogle.com. It contains all the videos, including the one that you saw today. And last slide. On that website is a practical guide to prebunking. So this is our first step at open sourcing exactly what we did here in this process in Central Europe. We released this actually at the prior Fighting Misinformation Online Summit in Brussels in November. This is free and accessible on our website, and it was published alongside the BBC and the University of Cambridge. And I think that's it for me. Last slide is just to say thank you. I appreciate your attention, Kitos, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Beth Goldberg. Wonderful to have you with us today. If you have any questions to Beth, just raise your hand and we read the microphone out to you. Any hands up? No, not yet. I would like to ask you, Beth, what is the best way to teach prebunking skills in your opinion?
Well, I think I'd love people's recommendations on this. One of the things that we've done in the past is workshops, where we've actually, in Prague last summer at a Fighting Misinformation online event, we hosted a live workshop where people actually wrote their own prebunking messages based on misinformation that they had seen in their own communities. I think we are each experts at the misinformation in our own ecosystems. And so we are the ones who can best craft those prebunking messages to protect others against that misinformation. I think another way that this could be taught is for journalists who are already engaged in fact-checking efforts. They are real experts on the trends in misinformation over time. They would be excellent at prebunking as well and in spreading that message to their audience through the media.
And to keep the processes and sources open is, of course, important as well. How can we add more source details to material online? Is it possible?
Yes, I think this is beyond my area of expertise, but I will definitely agree with you that source information is absolutely critical. It's a key component of media literacy, is understanding the source of facts. And I think it helps us build trust and know what we can believe in and what we can't. So yes, we should absolutely be adding more source material. I think with prebunking, the source is actually less important because you're really looking for these patterns in not what the misinformation is saying, but in how they're saying it. And so it actually doesn't matter if the source has, a fake logo of an institution that should be trustworthy. Sometimes that logo can be fabricated. And so if you know, hey, this really reputable newspaper probably wouldn't say this. It probably wouldn't be manipulating my emotions like this with fear. If you're able to spot that, it can complement your ability to look for sources.
Yes, this is something that is very important to understand. We have one question from the audience. Here you go.
Hello, I'm Elsa Kivinen, and I would like to know from Faktabari, a Finnish fact-checking agency, I would like to know more of the examples of the pre-bunking videos, apart from the one you showed. What other narratives or examples were pre-bunked and how?
Gladly, yes. We started off with videos that we showed in the United States and the United Kingdom that focused on general misinformation techniques. We wanted to look at political information very broadly and then try to pre-bunk it in as apolitical a way as possible. So at speeches from politicians, we looked at different information that was in the popular press about really hot political topics. And we identified that there were a number of common misinformation techniques, things like false dichotomies, pretending that there's only two choices, or ad hominem attacks. This is a Latin expression that means the person instead of talking about the problem itself. And so we identified a few of these techniques that are often used in political information, and we designed short, very humorous, playful videos to really make sure that these didn't feel political at all. And we showed those to people in the US and the UK, as I mentioned, so those are available online. We've also developed videos that were specific to the coronavirus vaccine hesitancy. We did a series of surveys and interviews with people who were vaccine hesitant in the United States. As you know, there's still a very large proportion of population. I don't want to pretend like I remember the exact statistics, but it's larger than you would want it to be, who are still not vaccinated against COVID-19. And this was early when the vaccine was fully available. We started to survey people why. What were the misinformation narratives that were driving their hesitancy, their refusal to get the vaccine? And we identified 3 top narratives, one of which was that the vaccine was dangerous. It was perceived by people to cause some sort of physical harm. There were claims that it would paralyze them or it might kill you. But whatever it was, I think the meta-narrative was that the vaccine is more dangerous than the virus. And so we said, hey, that's a very prebunkable message. And we got doctors and nurses as actors to come actually film for these short 30-second videos explaining why the vaccine was less dangerous than the virus itself. And so those videos we tested in a lab, and then we've shown those on YouTube as well. There were a couple other examples I mentioned about male and white supremacy, but I think the health misinformation and then the general misinformation techniques are probably the 2 best examples we have, and they have lots of rigorous testing that you can find on that website that's linked there. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Beth Goldberg. Wonderful to have you with us live from New York. Thank you. And have a nice day.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.